things. Hold on 1 second. I don't think I can speak smoothly while hunching. You know what I mean?
I guess, yeah.
Hold on.
Your neck is nice too, but
Yeah.
I think we all prefer your eyes.
Yeah, I like my eyes too. They're very expressive when I talk.
I know. It's important not to miss that part.
Yes. Okay, hold on. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, I wonder what it is.
I don't know.
Yeah, because we didn't have that problem before.
I know.
I don't know. Okay,
No,
well,
we're good.
So yeah, I didn't watch the full live today. I was on for a little bit, and I threw that question in there about trauma and mental illness just because I wanted to know if she was going to cover it. And that wasn't a topic that she was going to cover, but I'm definitely happy to talk about it here. When it comes to, I mean, do we want to go over a quick briefing? Like, I know that you did a live with Rachel a couple of months ago, or your first one was with her. Do you want to do a quick briefing about the topic, and then I'll dive into the trauma piece?
Sure. So, okay, so the first topic that we ever did on Mental Health Monday was what's the difference between mental health and mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, like, in a nutshell, Rachel said we all have mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And some people have mental illness.
Yes.
But people who have mental illness could be extremely mentally healthy, and
Mm-hmm.
people who don't have a mental illness can be mentally unhealthy. So I guess that's in a nutshell.
Me?
And you could check it out on our, yep. You
Okay.
can check it out on our, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, so you could check it out on our YouTube channel. So that was that.
Yeah, that's a good briefing, and I definitely encourage people who are watching now to jump in with any questions as we go into the topic, just because I'm going to go straight to trauma and mental illness, and then if there's anything you're wanting to know, like more background, foundational information, definitely put it out there in the comments, and we'll add it to the conversation. So when it comes to trauma, which is something that I definitely work a lot with in my practice, and it's a field of mental health and humanity that I study a lot, and that's very dear to me. Trauma impacts every part of our lives, and it impacts different people in different ways. Another important piece to mention before I go into the conversation is trauma is not necessarily something that has to be a big, huge situation that people everywhere would know as trauma, like rape or having someone very close to you die suddenly, or being in a car crash, or having one's home fall apart because of a hurricane. It doesn't have to be something kind of this big to be considered trauma. And I think that's actually something that was a big conversation on Rachel Tuchman's page on Matzah Shabbos on Saturday night, where, I don't know if you followed along, but it was basically a conversation about how these little things that a lot of us endure during childhood are actually super traumatic. The conversation that she was having was about hitting, like punching and hitting in particular. And that is a huge, huge piece of trauma that a lot of current young adults carry with them, not even necessarily knowing that they have endured trauma. And that's very, very important for us to know that these things have an impact. So being hit, getting hit as a kid, or watching a sibling being hit or abused is hugely traumatic. Neglect, intergenerational trauma. If anyone has grandparents who, let's say, went through the Holocaust, or grandparents went through any kind of persecution in their home country and then came here, which again, a lot of current young adults have that history. If that cycle was not looked at, if your parents didn't have an opportunity to look at what they're bringing with them and what their current kind of life situation is doing to their kids, then you're carrying trauma. It's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It just is. It's, you know, it's the fact of the matter. Just like we have limbs. Hi, Kaylee. Just like we have any part of our body and any part of our psyche, that's part of what we carry with us. Now, one of the things with trauma, with, you know, the second trauma that I just explained, a lot of times it's called relational trauma because it's trauma that directly impacts our ability to relate, right? To relate to other people, to relate to ourselves. And it's trauma that happens in a relational context. It happens between mother and child, father and child, sibling and sibling, teacher and student. So that's why we call it relational trauma. What happens with a lot of these things is it has several impacts, right? When we look at trauma, it's not just the trauma that happened, right? Let's say a person might say, my trauma is that I grew up with a mother who would hit me anytime I did something that she didn't like. Okay, let's say a person would say that. Now, we can look at that and be like, oh, wow, that was the trauma. That's the thing the person needs to heal from, right? But trauma actually has more facets than that, right? Because trauma is, number one, what happened, right? Mom hit the child whenever the child did something mom didn't like. Okay? That's trauma. The second part of trauma is, what did the child have to do in order to stay safe in this environment, right? So we might think about, well, the child needed to develop a sense of hypervigilance, right? The child, part of the trauma now is not only what happened, but what the child needed to do. The child needed to develop a sense of hypervigilance and kind of always being on the lookout. And that almost becomes a trait. It becomes almost what people call personality because it carries on later in life. But it developed because the child was living in trauma. The child was living in fear of when will they get hit again. They might flinch even as an adult when someone raises their hand because they're worried, like, oh my gosh, is it going to happen again? All these defense mechanisms that the person had to use, it's part of their trauma. And the third piece is what did not happen because of the trauma? What did not happen because this child had a mother who would hit them constantly again and again? And what didn't happen was a relationship between parent and child. What didn't happen was a calm, safe, secure environment where the child can thrive and live. What didn't happen was normal, natural, developmental steps that a child has to go through. And it couldn't happen because the child was living in fear. Now, when we look at these combined factors, it helps us understand a little bit more why there may be some people who are children and then adolescents and then they go into adulthood and then suddenly we see them presenting with personality disorders or different kinds of kind of mental illness. And if we look at it just, you know, I know that some people like the term chemical imbalance. Right? Like, oh, well, this could happen to anyone, which is true. These mental illness could befall anyone, just like the flu could befall anyone. But mental illness's trajectory is very different than the flu's trajectory, which is what I want to put out there today. People might say, oh, it's chemical imbalance. And that is a very, what we call medical model of mental illness. It looks at the mental illness purely through a lens of the brain. Our neurons, the chemicals in our brain, the firings, and doctors, a lot of doctors and even therapists can kind of put it out there in a very medical way. They can put the medical terminology out there and explain which neurons are firing and therefore what needs to be fixed and changed in order to make the person whole again. So that's one way of looking at it. But that does not, hi Yeti, but that does not honor the fact that the person presenting with mental illness today is a person who has lived on this earth and has lived in this world for many years leading up to today. And that in healing mental illness, in honoring mental illness for what it is, we must look at the person's trauma history in order to know what kind of safety do they need, what kind of environment will do best for them to help them live with what the effects are. So that's just a very, very important piece. The second we add trauma in it, we can start to understand what's going on. We can have a lot more empathy and compassion for what the person is going through when we have that context. When we understand that any person presenting with mental illness today has an entire history of things that they've been through, whether they're aware of it or not at this time, but they have a context that builds a reason and a little bit of information for what is going on with them today. Now,
but it doesn't have to be like a hit. It could just be...
No, it does not have to be being hit. Absolutely not. I use that as an example, and great point. It could be any form of trauma. I know a lot of people suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, have a lot of different kind of mental illness diagnoses. A person suffering from PTSD, let's say a person who was molested for many years, right? And didn't have anyone to tell, didn't have someone to care for them, didn't have someone to intervene and stop the abuse. They may go into young adulthood and all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, they're depressed, they're anxious, they're maybe abusing drugs, they're caught up in a web of addiction. And if we look at it only through the medical model, we can be like, okay, there's depression, there's anxiety, there's addiction. Let's treat this. But the second we sit down, I mean, the way that I do therapy a lot is, of course, I collaborate with psychiatrists and anyone else that we need on the team for the person. But the second we sit down and I start hearing a little bit more about who are you? What's your life story? What have you been through? And they start maybe sharing about years of being molested, years of boundaries being violated, years of being neglected, maybe even having told someone and being told that they're lying. How would they not have anxiety? How would they not be fearful to live in this world? How would they not be depressed? How would they not be stuck in a web of addiction trying to escape the hell that their life has become? So this doesn't excuse it and be like, oh, well, yeah, now I understand because they had trauma. Now they're mentally ill. Okay, well, this is it. This is life. No, this doesn't kind of just it doesn't close it. Instead, it opens it. It opens our understanding of what has this person been through? What kind of safety do they need alongside all the other treatments that they may be wanting to engage in order to heal?
Do they have to, can somebody develop an illness from an intergenerational perspective? Like if their grandparent suffered the Holocaust, could the, like a few generations later, be still suffering from the mental illness?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's where the conversation between nature and nurture comes in. Because a lot of people, again, in the medical model, there is one belief, and a lot of studies have kind of been done and tested and shown that there may be a genetic component to various mental illness, right? A genetic component, meaning that people might say, well, if your mom was depressed, you're prone to depression. Or if your mother had borderline personality disorder, for example, which if we have time, we can talk about that as a whole, because that has a huge trauma base. But then a person might say, well, if your mom had borderline personality disorder, then you have it. Or if your mother had anxiety, then you're likely to have it. So that's, again, looking from a medical model, very genetic, mom to child, dad to child. However, when we put nurture into it, if a child grew up with a mother or a father and saw that mom's way of coping when things get really tough is to close down and collapse and fall into bed and be what we understand as depressed, right? It starts going into the child's brain and mind and body as a way to cope. We learn when we're tiny and little, we come into this world, we don't know much about what this world is, right? We don't really know what we're supposed to do when something's really difficult. We don't really know what we're supposed to do when money is tight, or when things are going rough in school or with friendships or relationships. We don't know. What we do is we're tiny and we're little, and we look around to the big people around us, right? Now, that is part of how we learn, and the best we can do, it's called modeling. We mimic those people, and we kind of figure things out, right? Like it's a game, but that's the child's life. Now, if a child sees when things are rough, when relationship stuff are tough, or when money is tight, mom collapses, and again, goes into what we understand as depression, the child starts knowing that this is how we cope with things. Or if that same child knows that, oh, wow, every time something every time mom and dad fight, or whatever, mom, dad, whatever it is, right? They fight. My parent goes and pours himself a drink, and he drinks, and all of a sudden they're not fighting anymore. There must be something interesting about a drink. And we're tiny. We don't really, it's not yet a space where we really know. We just energetically pick things up. We look, we see them. Wow, okay, that drink is a really interesting thing. And then maybe, you know, we try it. And maybe when something goes, you know, we're studying for a test and it's really difficult, and maybe, oh, look, Tati's leftover mix is right here. Oh, maybe I'll give it a shot. So we model, we learn, we take it in, we mimic, we model, and that becomes who we are as an adult. So to me, it's not a shock when I see someone's main defense is depression, and I start hearing about, how did your mom cope with stuff? How did your dad cope with things? And I start understanding, wow, this was the modeling they received. It makes sense that this is where they're going to go. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not always like that. There may be a person who's suffering from depression and never saw depression in their home. Like, I can speak about a client, of course, changing all information, and there's no identifying detail, but a client who did come in presenting with depression, and let's say it's a woman, let's say, and in understanding more about her family history, which is something we always do in therapy because it's so crucial to who the person is. She said, oh, my mother was the happiest person, always happy. And I hear the word always linked with the word happy. I get little like ding, 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 always happy. And the more I hear about her mother, the always happy woman, the more we start to understand that the mother wasn't always happy. The mother had all.
She was a good faker.
Exactly. She had all sorts of feelings, but was not allowed to express them. Like if we go into her own mother's situation, there may have been a need to be a certain kind of wife, the need to be a certain kind of mother. The grandmother was highly depressed a lot of the time, right? The woman sitting in my office, her grandmother had what we understand to be classical clinical depression. Ergo, her mother said, I'm never doing that. Never. I know what that did. Right. I know what that did to me. So she is now always happy, but there's such debilitating sadness inside, and that gets transferred energetically to the children.
Oh yeah, we talked about that last time, right?
Yes. So it's no shock that a person sitting in my office is presenting with depression right now. And again, this doesn't take away the need to address what's coming up, right? A person who is severely depressed, let's say, or severely anxious may not be able to start understanding how their trauma affects their present life. That may not be the place. When a person comes in to a doctor's office and they're bleeding because they flew off their motorcycle and something happened to them, their hand is hanging by a hair, that's not the time for the doctor to sit down and talk about, motorcycles, they're pretty dangerous things. And if you go on a motorcycle on a busy highway when it's raining, this and this might happen. That's not the time. Right now, the doctor is going to take care of what's in the room right now, right? Let's look at the hand. Is it broken? What does it need? Do we need some pills? Do we need something to wrap it up with? What kind of supports are we going to put so the arm continues to heal? And then when the person is kind of, the triage has been taken out, like, okay, the person is stable, there's whatever medication they need, there's whatever supports in place, then the conversation can be about, wow, so you were out and, you know, in the rain, in the snow, on a highway, on your motorcycle. Let's talk about that. Right? So when someone comes to my office, of course, trauma is always the lens that I see things through, but that doesn't mean that we're going, you know, when someone is kind of needing triage, that we're going to sit and talk about the trauma. It's something that I'm always kind of tracking, always keeping different tabs open for the client as they're sitting in the office with me. But in the moment when someone is presenting, especially at the start, when there's a breakthrough or something's going on, we need to address what's going on right now. And that can be many different ways. Clinically, it could be with various kinds of therapies. It could be with medication. It could be collaborating with different teams of professionals to make the initial kind of jump start on what the person is experiencing right now. And then we look at the trauma. Because the more we understand, the more we process about what we're carrying, the less we need to kind of give it out physically and emotionally. Right? The more ownership we can take of our story, the more we can understand how our history impacts our present, it allows us to live and breathe much more freely and much more lightly.
So Link's Shlomi's Club had an interesting statement. It's true that the nature nurture, but there are still cases when a person suffers from all sorts of mental illness without any parental influence. And I say that because so many parents blame themselves, and it's not always so.
Okay, give me a second. I'm sweating. I just need to like wipe my brow. It's very hot, guys. If you're not in New York, it's very, very hot. Actually, let me turn a fan on. Let me put something in place for myself. Give me a second.
Good idea.
Right? Modeling. Hold on.
Yeah, because I think that what you were saying. Can you hear me?
Hold on, I'm here. Oh, that was my phone. Okay, I'm here now.
Because I think what you were saying was not necessarily that it's the parents' fault, but that the coping. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that the coping mechanisms that they use could have been passed down from generation to generation. Is that
yeah, not only could have been, but definitely are.
So
it's not so
it's not the parents' fault. The mental illness is not. Is that
absolutely not the parents' fault? And I want to say something that has definitely taken me a while to really honor and see as truth. Our parents, wherever they were when they were raising us, did the best that they could with the tools they had available at the time. They really, really did. And again, for me, it was a journey. Like, it's not something that, oh, I'm a therapist, I believe it and I know it. It took a while for me to really, to know it. You know, sometimes I could know it and then I could know it. But it really is true. Our parents and even who we are right now and who we were in the past are only doing the best that we can with the tools we have available. If someone had a mother who did not have tools to deal differently with stress, that's the card they were dealt with in life. As much as we might like to change the way things are and save all the children who are suffering, those are the cards that were dealt. Now, I'm not going to do feel-good psychology and tell people, yeah, sometimes mental illness just happens. I don't know. That would be betraying, you know, my own learning, my own studying, my own research, and that of many, many fellow scholars and researchers and therapists. At the same time, I can be super compassionate when I say that the things that we saw or experienced as children shape who we are today. Both can be true at the same time, right? I can fully know and understand that whatever we saw at home, whatever we saw when we were growing up, shapes who we are, including mental health, including mental flourishing, including mental illness, right? It impacts both. But at the same time, I can be very compassionate and say, whatever the parent was doing, whatever the parent was exhibiting was a regurgitation of what they saw at home. And again, the second we go 2 generations up from young adults today, we're going back many years to a time where there was not the wealth of research that we have today. There was not an understanding of who little humans are, of what children are. There just wasn't. And we go back just 100 years ago. I mean, children, if we think about and we read about, Alice Miller does a great job of dissecting this. The way children were seen and treated mainstream by good parents was something that if we read it today, it's like, oh my goodness. Like in Alice Miller, I forget in which book, I think her book is For Your Own Good. She copies parenting manuals from, I don't know, the 30s, the 40s, and you know, reading it boggles the mind that that's what good parents were doing to their children, and that's not too long ago. So it wouldn't really be honest for us to say, I don't know. No, we're still living in the after effects. Absolutely, today, there is an abundance of information. People are waking up. There are awakenings happening all over in all different kinds of communities, and it's beautiful. But at the same time, it makes us even more aware of everything that went on, and everything that we endured, and everything that brought us to where we are today. So it's not about blaming. Of course, people in healing go through a stage of blaming and bargaining and being really angry at their parents, and that's 100% okay. That's part of the process, right? If a child was never allowed to be upset with a parent, it's actually healthy for them to sit in therapy and be really angry at a parent. That's fine and safe and okay to do in the presence of a supportive other. And then part of healing is being able to step away from the blaming situation and on some level really have compassion for who the parent was, who their parents were, and then who their parents were. Like it goes up and up and up, and really know that our parents and their parents and their parents and their parents did the best they could with the tools they had at the time. And then if they didn't have many tools, or if the tools they had were rusty or didn't really work, then we are inevitably impacted by it. So, yeah.
I subscribed to Sarah Chana Radcliffe's email. So she sends these like really, really short emails, like you read in like under a minute. And I forwarded one of them to my husband last week. I think it was either this week or last. It must have been last week. And it was just like, it was very simple, but for some reason, it just blew my mind. And I forwarded it to him and I said, don't you wish we read this like 10 years ago?
Ooh.
And
what was the email about? What was the
It was
main
like
thought?
a parenting, just like the way to talk to your kids, like reframing things in a positive, like just choosing your words better. I'll forward it to you. But
now I want to sign up. You're saying it's under a minute. I want to sign up.
Yeah, okay. It's so good. She sends really short ones because I don't like reading long ones, but she sends really short ones every day. So he forwarded it. He replied to me and he's like, "It's never too late."
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So, I love that.
Yeah. So
I love really that. Nice. Yes. Because again, had you had those tools 10 years ago, maybe things would have been a little different in your relationship with this person or that person or this child or that child. But then guess what? You got the tools now.
Yeah. And you know what? And I even have apologized to my kids before.
Wow.
How
healing.
I was dealing with one of my teenagers and I heard myself say something to him that I was kicking myself. And I actually waited because I just needed to kind of process it. I waited 2 weeks.
Wow.
And then I called him. He was away. He's away for high school. And I called him and I said, I was thinking about our conversation from 2 weeks ago, and I felt so terrible about it. And I feel like I'm really sorry, because I would have hated if somebody talked like that to me. And you know what? He really appreciated it. So I really like encourage everybody, like, it's, if you make a mistake, you can fix it. And your kid, it's not like we showing weakness.
No. And think about the modeling we spoke about, right? What you're modeling to your child is rupture and repair, taking ownership, that it's safe to be vulnerable. I mean, those are just a few, but that's just absolutely beautiful. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, because a few people have told me before, don't apologize to your kids. It shows that you're that you know that you don't have authority, or I don't know. I've heard like a bunch of
there's all sorts of reasoning to protect ourselves from vulnerability with those younger than ourselves. Absolutely.
Yeah, but I think that they really, I think it empowers them, but it also makes them respect you more.
Yes. It's so deeply healing. I mean, it really, really, really is. Wow.
Chaya said, please define what happens when a person is suffering with mental illness. But I think we kind of, were you asking from the beginning? Because we kind of reviewed that, and can you just be more specific about the question?
I want to hear it. Is that like what happens to lead a person there, or is it or is the question more about a specific mental illness and what the experience is? Because we can go either. I mean, we spoke about kind of the trajectory, about trauma and its relationship. But if you have a question, Chaya, about any specific mental illness and what the experience of a person suffering from that might be, definitely put the question, and I'll answer as best as I can.
And Growing Toolbox asks, do you do EMDR?
If I do EMDR, no. But I can always offer a referral. If someone is needing it or wanting it, they can hop onto my DMs, and I'll help as best as I can.
And Zahava said, they tell me mommies can make mistakes, right? Everyone can make mistakes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So beautiful. So beautiful. It warms my heart. Chaya says, what's the behavioral pattern of someone presenting with mental illness? I really just am asking for a little bit of more clarity in the question, and I'd love to answer.
But in case anybody missed it, so there was a live this morning with Rachel Tuffman, and she kind of went over the a little bit. Did you
go over general signs and symptoms? Did you do that?
Oh, maybe not. I don't. I know her focus was on how to support loved ones with mental illness.
Got it.
She did talk. The first live ever again was the difference between mental health.
Very informative live, absolutely.
Yeah, and mental illness. So anybody who wants to brush up on that could do that. So she said yes.
Yes to like what the symptoms are?
Like, we have on our website, www.jproactive.com, so you could take a mental health screening. If you're concerned about a mental illness, it might if you look on the resource page.
Yeah, signs and symptoms. Okay, sure, absolutely. So signs and symptoms will differ based on what the mental illness is. Some general things that might give you a hint that you or a loved one is kind of struggling with something that maybe, again, could be trauma reaction, could be mental illness, but are, some of the basics might be, so first let's say depression, right? Depressed mood consistently. Being sad is normal. sometimes feeling depressed is normal. Being consistently depressed, not being able to kind of snap out of it at some point, right? Not being able to get up in the morning, fluctuations in appetite, right? Kind of eating a lot when it doesn't feel consistent with what you're wanting to do, or eating very little even when you're feeling hungry. Sleep is a big one for depression and anxiety, like not being able to sleep or sleeping a lot more than you maybe want to or plan to. That's a big one. Mood is huge when it comes to depression and anxiety. So being irritable, feeling kind of angry but not knowing how to channel it. That's big when it comes to like anxiety, depression, and that side of things. Then there are those things that we understand as personality disorders, which is a very big topic. It's not easy to just kind of rattle off symptoms because they are nuanced and complex. Some things that might give you a clue that a person is needing additional support, that a person might want to go to a therapist and see if they can get a diagnosis, might be mood swings that feel out of your control, right? Kind of like suddenly feeling overtaken by a feeling or emotion and not being able to kind of take ownership or feel mastery over your experience. That's a big one. Not being able to stick to what you want to do, or maybe saying certain things and then seeing that your actions are not matching up to it, again, might give you a clue that something's going on, that you're experiencing something. Even with other disorders, anxiety and depression may be a big piece of it, just because those are, again, normal ways that we want to cope. When something's going really tough, depression helps us kind of collapse and we don't have to think about what's going on. And anxiety gives us the illusion that we're taking care of things. Yeah, I'm seeing this, I'm feeling this, let me take care of it. Oh, but if I don't take care of it, what might happen, right? And we kind of get to escape in that way. So those are just things that might pop up in general. They're like in the grab bag. They come out a lot. Then there's another, and I'm covering sparingly. There's so much when it comes to signs and symptoms that I would say, when in doubt, check it out. When in doubt, go sit with a therapist. It doesn't mean that your therapist is going to diagnose you with any kind of mental illness. Sometimes the therapist has to give a diagnosis if you're, let's say, using your insurance for therapy. Insurances, unfortunately, do work on the medical model, which means that a therapist must supply a diagnosis in order for treatment to be covered. So, speak to your therapist if that's a concern. But going to a therapist doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be diagnosed with anything. It just means that a trained professional can sit with you and help you and help you understand with you what your experience is, what's going on for you. And then I was going to go to another kind of branch on the tree, which is addiction, which some people understand as mental illness, and that is. It could go in any direction. It could be, substance abuse, alcoholism, workaholism, sex addiction, gambling. There could be like love and sex. Love and sex addiction is a little different than like sex and porn, like a little bit. There can be people using relationships in an addictive way. There's a lot there. Some of the main markers that we can use to understand addiction a little bit is if it's something that you have tried to stop but were unable to, and if it's something that gets in the way of kind of your day-to-day living. It's not something you want to do. It gets in the way of relationships. It gets in the way of work. It gets in the way of goals. That may be something that might have an addictive quality to it, and a therapist and specialized addiction treatment can help. So I hope that helps with like a breakdown of what some of the signs and symptoms may look like. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. There's so much more.
And a lot of these things could just be signs that you need to work on mental health.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so yeah.
How would somebody know when it's kind of beyond that?
It's fantastic point. So many of these things are literally some things that all you need is a little bit of support and scaffolding to put things in place so that your mental health can flourish. These things are not automatic symptoms of, oh my gosh, there's a mental illness and there needs to be kind of when a person is suffering from mental illness, the treatment looks very different than someone who's working on mental health, right? So these signs and symptoms don't automatically point to mental illness. Like you're saying, sometimes it just gives you a little clue. Maybe there's something I need to support myself more and nourish myself more. Absolutely. How would a person know? I would say it's very difficult to know on your own. Although I always say, trust your intuition, trust your gut, trust what's coming up for you, but also trust when you might need to bring in another person to kind of have a little bit of an objective view about what's going on. So I would say definitely seek the help of a professional, of a therapist who can sit with you and hear more about what's going on so they can help make the determination if this is something that needs a mental illness treatment track or if this is something that needs kind of a more supportive mental health work kind of track.
So there's a lot of questions.
Hold on, let me see some of the questions.
How far back are you going?
Okay, I'm going back to the question I just answered about the behavioral pattern. Yes, signs and symptoms. Okay. Did Rachel cover how to cope when close family members is clearly struggling but refuses to go for help? If not, Bruchy, can you address that? So I think that Rachel covered it. I know I was on the line for literally a few minutes, and I know that she was talking about close family members.
She did. I did catch that part.
Yes. Yeah. I know she was talking about, a family member who's kind of like waking up in the morning and saying, oh my gosh, I don't want to take my medication today, or I don't want to go see my therapist, or I hate my therapist. I don't like her anymore. She did touch on that. So Rock Solid Self, hi, by the way. Definitely check that out. And that's saved on your YouTube, right?
It will be.
Okay.
Right now it's saved on our story.
On your page? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I highly recommend it. Rachel is very knowledgeable and knows a lot, and I know that she did touch on that, so definitely recommend that. Zahava says, what about personality disorders in parents and egocentric or emotionally stunted parents? So personality disorders are huge. I think they're beyond the scope of this specific live. Maybe if we want, we can go ahead and schedule something for that because it's a very big topic and something that has a lot of different points of view when it comes to different professionals. I mean, you can speak to 5 professionals and then hear 5 different points of view and ideas about what personality disorders are. There are people who believe that it's something that you're born with and you die with and you can never change. There are professionals who believe that it's trauma-based but can never change. There are some people who believe that it's trauma-based but has potential to change. There's so much, so I'm not going to comment extensively on that, but I'm going to repeat that whatever was modeled to us by parents, whatever we grew up with as children and witnessed from our parents, makes a real difference in who we are. And this is something that I was preparing to write a post about this, and this is inspiring me to actually go ahead and do it, but I read something and it inspired me to think this line. What was it again? I think it was, history does not always, what was it? Let me quickly look it up because, hold on. Actually, I don't think I have it on my computer. Basically, like, history does not dictate your future, but history informs your future. Mm-hmm. Right? So history and like having a parent who had whatever personality disorder, whatever, and whatever view we want to take of that, right? It doesn't necessarily predict what's going to happen to you, but it informs who you are. It informs your relationship patterns. It informs your templates, right? Your relationship template, your work template, your stress template. It informs it. So definitely, I want to put that out there. Chaya says, can be in good mood also for several weeks in a row. So yeah, good mood, again, it's pretty relative. So I don't know what exactly it means for you right now, but definitely bipolar disorder does have kind of like a high and low type of trajectory where a person might feel extremely depressed for some time. Bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 have different periods of time that a person kind of has to be depressed in order for them to be called bipolar or have bipolar disorder. I realized I should be called bipolar. And like Rachel was talking about that today, and there's something I try to be conscious about. So that's interesting. Something I can think about. A person has bipolar, right? Just like a person has the flu, like Rachel was saying today. So in order for a person to be diagnosed with bipolar disorder, it needs to be a certain amount of time. But on the upside, kind of, on the other side, a person with bipolar disorder will experience a couple of weeks or a couple of days of an extreme high where they're in a very good mood and they're cooking and baking and starting projects and one of the things is having a lot of sexual conquests, like stuff like that. Big shopping sprees, maybe shopping for things that they don't really have the money for, until it kind of crashes again. So that's definitely something that could point to a person having this specific disorder. So I hope that answers the question. Chaya says, what brings about rage and triggers? I mean, triggers is anything that we have, any area of life in which we have a trauma bruise. If that gets touched, we get a trigger. It's basically reacting a little bit more from a survival place than from what's going on here and now. Rage, I mean, I'd have to hear a little bit more about what you're saying. Like sometimes the person is enraged. There are times where I feel very enraged. If I do something that is, problematic to another person, problematic to myself, potentially harmful to myself or another person, that's very different. Like feeling enraged and acting enraged are two different things. So the emotion, the feeling, the experience of feeling rage or feeling anger is sometimes very appropriate, whereas acting in rage, where there's potential of someone being hurt, might point to maybe a trigger, right? Maybe something's going on that the person is not acting out of their current adult self, but they're acting more out of a survival place where they need to, flail about to know that I'm going to survive this. I'm scrolling.
Can a child have bipolar disorder?
Again, another one of those topics that's highly debated.
Well, there's a lot of research that they're doing now.
Children?
I was just talking. My cousin is a psychiatrist who's part of a research team, trying to find early detection markers.
Yeah, I'll give you the early detection. Trauma. Hook me up with your cousin. Let's talk research. But no, all due respect, I really do respect the work that all kinds of professionals in the helping field are doing, whether it's through a medical model lens, whether it's pure trauma lens, whether it's from any other kind of therapeutic lens. It is all so helpful to the information we have today that helps us as adults be different in our lives and thus start creating ripple effects that will affect anyone in our lives, whether we have children or not. It's not always about the person with their own child. It's any humans that you interact with. The energy you give off in the world is different if you have the information and the ability to apply it. It's very, very different. So although I am definitely biased more kind of towards the trauma-based, trauma-focused type of care, just because this is the work that I do, this is the work that I really, really devote my time and energy to, and something I very much believe in. At the same time, I have extremely high respect for any other kind of research happening. So on that note, definitely, I'd love, if there's any links or stuff that your cousin is working on, I'd love to read it and hear more about it.
Yeah, I can send you her lab website. But I actually was talking to somebody, I can't even remember who, but that compared that that if there is a genetic component to a mental illness,
Yeah.
that environmental or nurture triggers will, so the same way that cancer, you could have a predisposition in your body for cancer based on genetic components, and if you're exposed to the triggers, the physical triggers that will then you'll get that cancer. But if you're not exposed to those triggers, then you won't get the cancer. So people could have a predisposition to mental illness, but not ever get a mental illness if they are raised with good mental health.
So that's what you're describing is a field that I love. I really do. It's the field of epigenetics. Have we spoken about it on a
maybe?
live?
Yeah, maybe.
I love it, so it may have come up.
Actually, I love the intergenerational trauma topic. We should talk about that sometime.
Oh my gosh,
I could talk about it for hours.
Yeah, and the trauma focused lens in epigenetics basically says, so let's say let's look at predisposition as like a little switch in a person's DNA, and I'm going to point to the brain just because like this is right here, and I'm going to point to my brain. But in a person's DNA, there are all these little like buttons and little switches. Imagine like all these wires. It's really intricate and beautiful. God's creation is just like it's immensely beautiful. Like I was on a trip recently, and one of the girls I was traveling with was saying, like, she was looking at something, she's like, oh my gosh, this is TMR. I said, what's TMR? She said, totally marabu. So
that's so cute.
Yeah, so like we see that when we look at nature, but the second we look inward, it's like, oh my gosh, TMR, totally marabu. So back to like the DNA, there are all these different switches and wires and all of that going on. Now, let's say a person is and it used to be believed that you're born with it, you stick with it, you die with it, right? And of course, the more research we're doing, it's like, no, actually the things you eat, the things you drink, the things you live in, the stress hormones, they can gently change your DNA. They can gently change the different types of buttons and wires that you have on there, or they can change the effectiveness of different buttons and wires, right? So let's go to the Holocaust, right? Let's say a person went through, they were 14 years old when the Holocaust started, and they went through all these really, really, really terrible things that you read about in the books and that you see in the Yad Vashem Museum and all of that. They experienced it, right? Now, when they were 14 years old, before going into the concentration camps, before all of that, their DNA may have been a flourishing, beeping. There were different kinds of colors, and there was one little button for health, and one little button for the ability to communicate, and one little button for for breath and all of that, right? Now, as they're going through the trauma, the intense, like just inexplicable trauma of the Holocaust, what happens is some of these buttons get rusty. They stop working. Let's say the breath, right? She can't breathe as well anymore. So that button, it's there, but it's kind of rusty. It can't really be pushed as much as it needs to. And other buttons start changing as well, right? Now, one of the things that might also happen is her way of coping. I'm going to go to depression just because it's something that is a little bit more seemingly simplistic, right? One of her ways of coping was withdraw and be depressed, right? It saved her life. Because she was withdrawn, depressed, kind of checked out, she was able to kind of go through the Holocaust and then come out alive. But what happened was, because it was something that she used so frequently, the depression, it's so powerful that what happened is, in her DNA, another little button was created, and that button is called depression. And anytime she's going through stress and pain, that button gets pushed and she goes into depression, and it's sad and painful, but it kind of helps her. That's how she's surviving, right? And that little button, every time she uses it, the button becomes a little stronger, a little stronger, a little stronger. Now, she survives the Holocaust, and what a lot of people did after the Holocaust was they paired up and they had more children because they wanted to, like, a lot of them were told to, a lot of them wanted to, like, reproduce and kind of deal with the trauma in whatever way they could and kind of repopulate again. So she goes and she does that. Now, her baby, right, never lived in the Holocaust. But the baby is created partly with her DNA, right? Mm-hmm. That baby, because it's, you know, her mother's DNA created a little depression button, that baby is born with a little button called depression. Okay? The button is there. It's part of her DNA. Now, if her mother is still carrying the pain, which means she's still acting in pain, right? Because that's the most she can do. She just lived through hell. Then it's very likely that this little child, her depression button will get pushed repeatedly, and she might also end up feeling really depressed and going to depression as a way to cope, right? She has the button. Why choose any other way to cope if the button is right there? All her body has to do is kind of give it a push, and she's, you know, kind of in a depressed space, right? Now, let's say she grows up and then she pairs up with someone or whatever it is, and she has a baby, and the baby is born, and the baby also has a depression button. But let's say this child is blessed to have a couple of teachers that are really inspiring and helpful and create space. And maybe this child has a friend whose parents don't have the Holocaust history, and she can play there and hang out there. So this little girl, right, the third generation from the grandmother from the Holocaust, also has that trauma button there, the depression button in her DNA, but it's not pushed as much, right? Let's say she grows up, and maybe once in a while it's pushed, but it's not there it's not being pushed all the time. Mm-hmm. She grows up, and maybe she starts doing, like, she's allowed to live a little bit, right? She can work out and engage in movement, and every time she lives and breathes, what happens to that little depression button, it sees, oh, I'm not being used, and it starts maybe fading away a little bit. It doesn't work as much. It doesn't happen. It doesn't bring depression on every time it's kind of pushed, because it takes a little bit more to push it, right? And while she's doing it, also think about, right, there's the DNA with the depression, but there's also all these other things that she's doing that are creating all these other fun buttons in her own DNA, right? There's mm-hmm. a button for meditation, right? Let's say she starts a meditation practice. She's breathing, and new connections are being made in her brain. And like all these other buttons are going, well, the depression button kind of gets lighter and lighter and lighter. And then let's say she has a child eventually at some point, right? Her child also has like a faint button of depression, because again, her mother still kind of had it, but it's so faint, and all the other buttons are so alive and vibrant that it becomes mm-hmm. less and less and less important for that button to be the one that you go to right away.
So it repairs the genetic makeup.
Yes, exactly. Right. And that's through a genetic lens, but adding the trauma perspective.
Right.
And yeah, and I find yes, you're saying you can change your DNA.
Yeah, there's so much research. Yes. There's so much research that if you could destroy the DNA with trauma, you could repair it.
Absolutely. With healing. Yes.
With healing. Yeah.
With healing, with support. I mean, there's brain scans and stuff that researchers are doing about epigenetics, when using meditation, different things like yoga, meditative breathing is hugely impactful on the correction in DNA and in neurological connection. So that's huge. And yes, that is so flipping cool. I know.
Yes.
It's incredible. So there's that. There's a lot of research being done, which is why I said earlier, like, I may have my bias, but I have such tremendous respect for all the research that's being done. And with an open mind, it's very easy to link my kind of trauma-based own research, anecdotal mm-hmm. research, work in therapy, and to link that with mm-hmm. all the other research happening in other fields as well. So
I do a lot of work with I work for, one of my clients is Holocaust mm-hmm. Education. Mm-hmm. And I do a lot of research, mm-hmm. and I came across so many studies. They're fascinating.
It's incredible. It's incredible.
And whatever, we could talk about it. It's like I literally could talk about this topic for hours.
Yeah, I know it's a very deep topic, and it has so many. Like, I don't even know which area of research you specifically like looked at or saw, but I know that the entire area of intergenerational trauma, intergenerational healing.
Well, that's what.
Yes, it's
But
incredible.
Also, there's so many studies in other ethnic groups, but that have also been through
yes
severe. So there's research studies like across the board that are all pointing to the same findings. So it's very cool, and that there can be a repair in the genetic makeup.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's so empowering. I know when I think about it, it's like, you know, the things that were handed down to us don't have to remain ours forever.
Right.
You know, so that's definitely a very, very empowering thing to know and to take in and apply.
Rock Solid Self says, there's a beautiful quote by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. I love him. Something about to heal from trauma, first build the future, then look back and heal. The Holocaust generation built the future, and now it's up to us to heal.
Interesting. I mean, that was definitely the way that a lot of post-Holocaust survivors were operating, where it was like, there was almost, it may have felt, and that wasn't I can't speak for them because it wasn't my lived experience, but my one interpretation may be that the only way they knew to what to do and how to go on was to kind of build something, and then our generation today can kind of look back and see with gratitude for like what, you know, their building the future brought us here, brought every one of us who is here right now. It's because someone way back said, I'm going to build a family. Now we can look back and say, oh, wow, well, they didn't have maybe some of them didn't have the best tools at the time and all of that. And there can be space to grieve that, to really grieve that. And for us to know that we're in a generation with such an abundance of resources and health and help and connection, that we really can take that and transform what was given to us for the future. So I think that's definitely powerful for us.
Hashtag therapy is cool.
Yes, yes, absolutely. That's a great page and a great hashtag. If anyone wants to look it up, it's a movement to kind of destigmatize therapy and the experience of mental illness and mental health as a whole. Hashtag therapy is cool. Absolutely. I kind of still want to get my tote. Do you have one? You know, she has those bags.
I'd love that. Oh yeah, lots of grief involved in the healing process. Oh yeah, that's a huge.
Yeah. Grief is tremendous. Absolutely. The time. Are we almost out of time?
I don't know. I don't have a clock in front of me.
It's 10:08.
Oh, I think we are out of time.
Yes, indeed we are.
But I do want to talk to you because that would be.
What was that?
It's like one of my favorite topics.
Yes, it's a fantastic topic, and I feel like I had all these notes, and
shoot,
so much of it was not even touched upon. It's such a tremendous topic. So guys, show some love. Maybe we'll do a sequel or.
Oh yeah, so I think December is going to be sequel month. I think we just booked with Shlomo Radcliffe. There was so much more to say about anger.
You said December would be.
Yeah, December is going to be sequel month.
Amazing.
So we'll book.
Count me in. Count me in. This is a fantastic topic, and there's so much to talk about.
We also do have Esther Goldstein is going to be talking about trauma.
Amazing.
A little bit.
Amazing. Yes.
I think she's the week of. I can't see my chart, but I think the week of Tisha B'Av actually.
Oh, very appropriate.
Yeah. And then actually this is an interesting, the week of Tu B'Av, the week after, is Dr. Rosmarin, who will be talking the Center for Anxiety.
Oh, yes.
So he's going to be talking about
relationships,
mental illness, and dating.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Did you plan that, or did it just come out like that?
No, he actually is going out of his way to be available that day.
Because, that's beautiful. That's beautiful.
So.
Wow.
So yeah, lots of good stuff coming up, and then you'll come back and we'll do some more.
Absolutely. It would be my honor, and there's always so much. I'm going to save my notes. So I
Okay,
can come back
awesome.
to it. I had planned on talking about more community,
Oh yeah, shoot.
family and individual based kind of things that all of us can do. I wanted to talk a little bit about education and normalization. So there's a lot, but I think I'm glad that we focused a little bit on trauma and mental illness, because I think that this is a super important foundational piece for people to understand, or for people to or for just to open some minds, to open pathways of understanding about the fact that every person, no matter what they're presenting with, there's a history there. There's a history there. Although we sometimes like to compare mental health and physical health and mental illness and physical illness, there sometimes is a big difference when it comes to physical illness and mental illness. With physical illness, there can sometimes be a person who just broke their arm, right? And of course, maybe they were jumping, maybe they did something dangerous, but maybe, they broke their arm, through no fault of their own. They were born with brittle bone disease or something like that. When it comes to mental illness, there's usually a very clear trajectory of who was this person, who are they born to, what did they go through, and then how are they coping with everything they're carrying. So, and this is of course said with tremendous compassion for the person and their parents and whoever raised them, as well as understanding that what we go through builds us. Although it doesn't define us, it does inform who we are. So happy to have been on here and discuss.
Thanks so much. And we'll book something.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I really want to hear what you have to say
absolutely,
about community.
Absolutely. There's so much. And thank you for providing the platform. Thank you, all of you, for being on.